Hello, everyone. My name is Catherine Beeson. I'm the executive director of the Longmont Symphony, and I'm delighted to be here with these special guests in advance of our April 23rd concert featuring Ancient Echoes, which is a world premiere. And we're just so excited about this piece. It has such an incredible story. I just want to take a moment to thank everybody for being here and give an opportunity for each of us to introduce ourselves. Marilyn, would you like to go first?
You bet. Hi, everyone. I'm Marilyn Martorano, and I'm an archaeologist who found the ancient lithophones.
I'm Michael Udow, and I'm the composer of Ancient Echoes.
My name is Tony Di Sanza. I am professor of percussion at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm thrilled to be the soloist on the premiere of Ancient Echoes.
My name is Elliot Moore. I am the conductor of the Longmont Symphony Orchestra, and we are thrilled to be bringing to life the world premiere of Michael Udow's Ancient Echoes.
I was born and raised in the San Luis Valley in southern Colorado and became an archaeologist and then ended up working a lot back down in the San Luis Valley at Great Sand Dunes National Park. And I've worked down there for a long time, over 40 years now. And when we were talking to people that pick up artifacts in the valley, we would see these really long, interesting looking ground stone artifacts. Some of them were up to 2 feet long and weighed 9 pounds, beautifully made. And we just couldn't figure out what they were. There were a lot of jokes that went around, and we thought they must have been some kind of huge grinding tool at first, but we looked at them under microscope and the wear patterns on them didn't match up to something that had been used for crushing and grinding. So there were some in the museum drawers at Great Sand Dunes, and we actually looked at those as well. We studied them for almost a year and couldn't figure out again what they were. So we put them back in the drawers. And then a colleague of mine sent me a YouTube video of a researcher from the Museum of Man in Paris. And this researcher had drawers full of these artifacts that looked just like ours. And they were actually from Africa and had been brought back to Paris in the early 1900s by French soldiers. And so this researcher was a jeweler, and for some reason he decided to tap on them with his jeweler's hammer. And that's when he realized they were lithophones. And when I saw this video, I thought, well, this is crazy, because no one in Colorado had ever talked about considering music as a function for an artifact like that. But I thought I was going to give the artifacts back to the park, and I thought I better just check it out. You know, nobody's going to see me, so I'll do this, because I had them at home the day before I was going to take them back. And so I set some of the long ones up, the 2-footers, on the table on some foam. And my youngest daughter is a percussionist, and she had a basket of mallets. And so I went over there and grabbed a bunch of different kinds of mallets, and I started tapping on them, and I couldn't get over it, because they rang like metal bells, or they sounded like, some of them sound like a wooden marimba, some of them sound like a xylophone. And I thought, this is amazing. So I talked to the Park Service people, and I talked to people at the museum, the History Museum in Colorado, and I ended up writing a grant. And I studied these for a couple of years and really got to know each artifact. And then I think it was 2018, Colorado Public Radio picked up this story about these lithophones, and then National Public Radio also picked up this story. And then I believe that's where Mike saw that story, and he contacted me. And so now there's a rest of the story to be told about what he did after he saw a story about how these lithophones have been found in the San Luis Valley.
That's fantastic. And so, Mike, tell us about you a little bit and about how you heard the story.
Certainly, about 20, 25 years, 30 years ago, I had an opportunity to play ancient lithophones in China and Korea and Taiwan that had been unearthed, and it was quite a remarkable sound. And fast forward to seeing this program that Marilyn had done, which was fantastic. And so I was eager to speak with her, and through the internet, I was able to locate her professional email address and contacted her. Lo and behold, we lived 2.5 blocks apart in Longmont. So I walked over at Marilyn's invitation, and she had her lithophones set up and was able to play them. And I was really excited about it. So I proposed to Maestro Moore that I compose a new work for lithophones and other percussion instruments and orchestra. And he got excited about it. And here we are today with this new composition with a fabulous soloist and a great conductor with the Longmont Symphony. And I'm thrilled that this work will be premiered.
Mike, where were you living before you decided to relocate to Longmont?
Well, my day job was a professor at the University of Michigan teaching percussion. And then in the summers, I was principal percussionist in the Santa Fe Opera for 42 years. So I kind of had a split life in that regard.
Well, we're very excited that you decided to move here, and I'm particularly excited that you made sure to mention that you did not stalk Marilyn, but you waited for her to invite you to her home before you walked the 2.5 blocks over there. I think that's great. Just,
Yes, indeed.
I mean, it's great to show initiative, Mike. You found her on the internet, and then the stalking stopped. I think that's wonderful.
Yes, and the real benefit after playing the Stones, and then we had a second session where Elliot came over, and Elliot and I improvised together with Marilyn, and afterwards, the cherry on top of the cake was that Marilyn and Sal, her husband, are winemakers. So we had lovely cheese and wine and talking about lithophones.
Yeah, Marilyn, you skipped over that part. You said archaeologist, and you said your daughter was a percussionist, and you mentioned a lot of study and grant writing, and not one word about winemaking. So I think we have some
Oh,
catching up to do here.
yeah. Well, you're welcome to come and visit our basement.
Okay, should I leave this part in the video or cut that part
Uh,
out? How many
maybe
people can fit in your basement?
uh, it depends how many. If you have straws, you can fit a lot. I don't know.
That's fair. That's fair. All
Yeah.
right. So we started with the story of Marilyn's discovery of the lithophones. We've now heard from Mike about the inspiration behind the composition, and now we get to Tony, our percussion soloist. So Tony, where are you right now? Where are you speaking to us from? It looks pretty amazing.
I am in my basement of my house in Madison, Wisconsin, which also serves as my percussion studio. I don't teach here, but I do my practicing and research here. And I also teach, I oversee the percussion program at UW-Madison. So I also have a teaching studio there, but this fun zone is all for me.
How did you get to be involved in this project?
I think this started around 31 years ago when I met Mike. As Mike was talking, I was doing the math in my head. Michael was actually my primary teacher and mentor through my graduate studies, my master's and my DMA a couple years after that. In the early 90s, we met when I auditioned for him to be a master's student in 1991. At the time, I was living in Youngstown, Ohio, where I had done my undergrad, and I was also teaching some public school because I have a public school music education degree. And wonderfully, I mean, especially wonderfully for me, we hit it off really well personally and musically with a lot of similar interests. And wonderfully, Mike asked me to do some playing with he and some other faculty, and we did some touring. And fast forward another 20 years after that, with lots of playing and spending time together. And then when this project started, wonderfully, somehow Mike sifted through all the names of all of his wonderful people he knows that play, and he landed on me and asked, and I was of course thrilled to do it.
That's fantastic. Now, when you are tasked with something like this, bringing a brand new piece to life in the world, how do you begin to approach it?
That's a great question because, of course, as I'm sure you know, and most everybody, if we're playing music that's in our repertoire and has been around, we can always reference all kinds of different recordings and interpretations. Of course, this is so much more like starting from scratch. So there's a lot of imagination involved in the score study. Has given me various versions of the piece as it was developing and before he had landed on the final version. Um, and so for me, it's a lot of looking at the orchestral part and trying to make sure I understand how that fits in with the percussion part. Um, but even more, of course, initially, especially, is becoming familiar with the percussion part itself. As a composer, Mike is not afraid to give the performers some room. And so, and especially as percussionists, a lot of times we're very used to improvising. So there are portions in the piece where Mike gives a sketch and then says, you know, you can play this or you can improvise in this style. And of course, the trick there is trying to figure out what is that style and what does that mean and what's the language that then that might work well with that style. Wonderfully, I've played so much of Mike's music in the last 30 years that I feel like I do know his vocabulary and the things that he values as a composer and performer. And if I'm not sure, of course, he's an intertube email away from and a Zoom call away from solidifying that. But so yeah, at this stage for me, it's a lot of score study, and then also becoming really familiar with the instruments and how I want to use them, and also the configuration of the instruments is a big deal initially. Where you're going to put everything, what instruments need to be played together at the same time, and how you build that. Sometimes that stuff comes with a new piece. In this case, Mike left that for me to sort of figure out with us with our conversation.
How many instruments do you have to negotiate?
One, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, nine, 10, or 11, something in there.
And is one of those the lithophones? Are you counting all of the bars as one thing, right?
That's a great question. Yeah, and those are families of instruments that I sort of just categorize. Some of them, a couple of them, like some of the drums are small, you know, two or three drums. Some of them, of course, like the lithophones, which I am addressing in this setting as a singular instrument, like we would a xylophone or you know the sort of historical great grandchildren of the lithophones.
Fantastic. So if people can sort of imagine a xylophone or a marimba, or a sort of a keyboard instrument with all of these bars laid out, that's the way the lithophones look for you as well, or are there variations and differences?
That's a great question. I'm not going to be able to fully answer. I can answer half of it because Michael also being inspired by Marilyn's discovery and finding these ancient lithophones created a modern granite lithophone. And Mike can tell you a little more about that, I'm sure. Um, and I have yet to play on that instrument. It's at Mike's apartment, and I have images of it. And so one of my tasks is, we talked about possibly shipping it here so I could play on it, but it's so enormously heavy. The cost was prohibitive. So I'm just going to get to Longmont about a week ahead so that what I've learned on the vibraphone I can transfer to the modern lithophone, which is set up totally like a vibraphone, a xylophone, a piano, and a standard Western keyboard setup. The use of the ancient lithophones, I haven't, I mean, I've seen images, but I haven't played them yet. Luckily, the material that Mike wrote for those is it's not very complex. So wonderfully, I feel confident that once I know where I'm going to put them in the setup, and I know approximately that I'll be able to manage that because there's only four or five pitches used there. I would assume they probably won't be set up in a keyboard fashion, but I guess they could be if one wanted to.
Mike, why was it so important for you to use instruments from around the world, from many different cultures?
Yes, The impetus for the piece, of course, were the ancient stones. From there, uh, I was considering that there are ancient stones from all over the world that have been unearthed and researched and played. So the idea was that I wanted to tip my hat, if you will, to many cultures that have had lithophones and relate them to other instruments that obviously developed afterwards. We have the Stone Age lithophones, but then we have the metal work of the Chinese cloud gongs and the prayer bells, and then we have the Indonesian angklung, which were wood, but it's a very sophisticated instrument. Each shaken instrument has 3 octaves within the one, we'll call it a idiophone, meaning a percussion instrument, but then there's a row of them that are tuned. So the whole idea was kind of a little bit of a world tour, and relating instruments of different types, materials, to, going back to the lithophone.
This is all pretty interesting. So you'll have a few of the ancient lithophones there, and then a brand new set of lithophones. I know, Mike, that you experimented with lots of different materials in order to come up with this particular type of granite. Do you want to speak to that a little bit? I feel like people would be really interested to know the inner workings of the percussionist's mind. That you just go whack things until you find the right sound.
Yes, and that can include junkyards as well. But in this case, uh, we I I thought about marble and granite, doing internet research. I found out that marble was not going to produce the sound that I was after, and it's a little bit more fragile. So, with help from the supplier of granite for the entire state of Colorado, which is in Denver, they recommended this absolute black granite from India. Well, it's a full slab weighs about 2,000 pounds, and that's the only way they sell it. But I was able to locate partial slabs in Longmont at various locations, and was able to purchase some offcuts. And then, interestingly, there's a granite, well, there's a countertop place, several, and one was Don's countertops, and he did a lot of help me initially in experimenting with various types of granite before I settled on the absolute black. And then he was too busy to continue, so Red's installations up on Route 66, just before I-25, Red was able to help me out. And these are very expensive blades and dangerous. They're diamond tipped circular saw blades, and the granite had to be lifted up on a forklift and carefully placed on the slab that then is computerized and rotates. And the cutting is done by lasers with water to cool the bit and everything. So it's a very complex process. So anyway, I tuned them there. And what was fun is that Red and his crew, it was just a job for them initially. So we were cutting the granite, and then I started to tune one, and they got kind of interested in it. And then when I had 4 or 5 and started playing them as musical notes together, their ears really perked up. And then from there on, for the next 3 weeks, as I was working in the shop with Red and the guys, aside from barbecues out in the backyard, which was lots of fun at lunchtime. Anytime someone would come in to pick up their countertops or to look at materials, they would grab them by the shirt collar and bring them into the shop, say, listen to this, and then they grab the mallets from me and start playing the lithophones because they got so excited about it. So we had a great time building the instrument together.
You know, I'm struck by this story. And Marilyn, I wonder if you have some insights that you could offer here, because we just heard about very expensive diamond tipped laser cut technology used to make these modern lithophones. And yet the ones that you found were done by hand, with grinding techniques, you said, and chipping
Right.
techniques a little bit. And
Yes,
but I'm betting that the people that made the lithophones you found still had this kind of joyous experience.
I'm sure they did. People in the past used stone for so many different tools. And so our thought is that people were making something and then, somebody struck it, maybe to take a piece off, to take back to camp. And of course, there was probably a musician amongst those people. And that musician probably said, hey, I'll take that. That's not going to be, what you thought it was. It's now going to be something else. And they think that it could have taken months and months to hand shape these, because they didn't have the tools, obviously, that we have today. And so they had to do it by hand. And these are really hard stones, they're granite. So you'd have to hit them pretty hard. But if you hit them too hard, of course, it's going to break. And so they must have learned by trial and error how to make these. And I think they were probably really prized possessions, because we don't find that many of them. We find a lot of other types of artifacts, but lithophones, you don't find as many. And it's probably because it was hard to make them and only certain people did it. But they actually could, make a sound that they wanted, just like Mike did. They could tune it and create a certain sound. So even thousands of years ago, they were doing that as well. So I just think it's very intriguing that people thousands of years ago spent the time to do it and that they could do it.
You know, I think it is really interesting too, because we have Elliot in the room who is going to draw like all of these elements together, right? So we have all of the musicians that are on stage in the orchestra playing all of their different instruments. Together with the percussion soloist, we have these ancient lithophones, these modern lithophones, instruments from around the world. Elliot, where does your part in this puzzle kind of come in and draw it all together?
One of the things that I think has been so amazing about this entire project was, that I have this wonderful blessing to be, tasked with drawing people together in Longmont for the sake of music. And when Mike presented this concept to me, I thought, oh my gosh, we have ancient instruments from 5,000 years ago that are going to be on the stage alongside these modern instruments. And we have this incredible Longmont connection with both Marilyn and Mike being from Longmont. And I just thought, this is such relevant music making that we have the possibility to do. And of course, for an orchestra to sort of commission a new work to bring instruments from 5,000 years old, as well as modern instruments, as well as everyone who lives in the area all together to create something spectacular. It was kind of too good to pass up, of course. And so I have the blessing of just being the yes man, where I can say, yes, I think this is a great idea. Let's do it. Mike, why don't you write a concerto and figure out how to create instruments? And one of the things that was so interesting, when we kind of all met together for the first time, was that Marilyn said something to the effect of, well, you can't just use these instruments on a random Saturday evening because they belong in a museum. And so I think that initially we realized that there were going to be some hurdles that we had to overcome. And seeing how everybody has overcome all these hurdles to create this work, which is so timely. It's very inspiring to just be part of it. So I'm really looking forward to bringing this work to life, but of course bringing it to our community in Colorado, where everyone is kind of from and where this really originated. It's just a wonderful, wonderful story that we are creating in some ways from nothing.
I think that that is really an interesting way of putting it. We're creating a story in some ways from nothing. Isn't that the story of all human genius?
You know, there's something which is really fascinating that Marilyn, you brought up the other day, which is that I think the assumption when you first found these was, well, maybe these are some kind of, grinding tool for grinding grain because everybody needs to eat to survive.
Right.
So you were looking at some kind of real functional, use for these, but at the end of the day, they wound up actually being something for beauty, something for art.
Yes.
And I think that for all of us to consider that people 5,000 years ago, they also cared about art, and that was something that was critical to them. Given the context that we're living in now, I think it's also great for us to remember that art is critical now. And so we are doing a very human thing by bringing this to life. And again, these were all the reasons why I wanted to do this amazing thing that we're doing, and that Mike Udow, of course, brought to my attention. I'm so glad he did, because we are doing something which is, I think, critical now for all of us. So I do hope everybody comes to the performance.
Okay, so now quick round robin. Same question to each of you. What is the coolest thing that you're looking forward to from this performance, Elliot?
Drinking wine in Marilyn's basement.
Fantastic. Okay, you're hired.
Okay.
Tony, what's the coolest thing you're looking forward to for this performance?
I, I mean, there's a lot of things, but I have to say, actually playing on the lithophone the week before rehearsal, and very excited to hear how it sounds, because the sounds I have in my head in my basement are not, of course, quite, even though I've heard the instrument, aren't quite yet fully formed. So I would have to say that is a big deal, and some wine in Maryland's basement, of course, is high on the list as well.
Okay, Mike, it's your turn.
Uh, Having the ability to listen to Elliot's interpretation and Tony's interpretation, and that sharing that comes together between the two of them with the orchestra, but also sharing this new score with the audience. And the music that I really strive to write is something that I want to reach into the hearts and minds of the audience, and so that they don't just leave and forget about it the next day.
Marilyn, what's the coolest thing you're looking forward to about this performance?
I think it's just hearing the ancient lithophones, which I've heard a lot, of course, but hearing that sort of journey through this composition to the present. So it's sort of past to present. And for me, that's really important, because archaeology is always looking at the past, but we want to make it relevant to today. And so I think that's exactly what this concerto does, is help make the past relevant, and hopefully make people feel a connection, like I do when I see these ancient lithophones. I feel a connection to the people that made them, to the music. And I just think this piece is going to really exemplify that whole sort of journey. Yeah.
That's so cool. Tony, you've been the one that's really been immersed in the music for the longest amount of time, even without the modern lithophone at your disposal. What do you think the audience is going to walk away with, feeling dazzled by, or intrigued by, or wanting to know more about?
I would say two things. One is just the sheer diversity of timbres they're going to hear, which is sort of natural when percussion is involved, especially percussion sort of expanding beyond our historical orchestral percussion section. So I think to not only hear the ancient lithophones, the modern lithophone, but all of those paired and connected to all of these other instruments from around the world, I think I think people will hopefully find that really exciting to listen to and something memorable. And then I would say also, Mike's compositions are wonderfully melodic and horizontal, and they bring up wonderful tunes. And so I suspect the audience will also be able to really latch on. While there's all this sort of abstract stuff going on in the percussion that not everybody knows exactly what's happening, it's still just there are tunes and there are songs and within what's happening. And then the third thing I'd say also is the way Mike uses some of the strong, like the most powerful drum in the setup, the large Odaico right behind, emerges a couple times, but most with its most strength at the end. And the drum itself is an enormous sound, and it's in a conversation with the orchestra. And I think even just the mere fact that that's at the end and it's so powerful will hopefully also have a strong impact on folks.
I love all of this, and I would be remiss if I didn't, as the, boss lady executive director over here, say that on April 23rd at 7:30 p.m. at Vance Brand Civic Auditorium, not only will you hear this wonderful world premiere, but it's going to be paired with two other really very powerful works. And I think that this is such an interesting combination. So, Elliot, would you just take a moment to speak to the curation element here with Stravinsky's piece and Mike's piece and the Brahms symphony on this program together? I think it's just such an exciting combination.
I think from Stravinsky's Firebird, how one thing builds on top of another to create incredible art and incredible melodies and to kind of give flight. To me, it seems like we're giving flight to these 5,000-year-old stones. And I think that there's a combination of these two works that just sort of one complements the other. So I think that the Firebird is going to bring into relief Mike's concerto. And then Brahms' First Symphony, in many ways, people have sort of called it Beethoven's 10th Symphony, because it was this sort of continuation of this lineage of orchestral writing. And it's a different sound world, obviously, than the Stravinsky and Mike's piece. But it's one that I think is just going to give such closure to a magnificent evening of music. So it's got balance, it has sort of counterpoint and counterplay, and I think it's going to be a spectacular evening.
I couldn't agree more. The only request I have, Tony, is that you run on stage during the very opening of the Brahms, and play the Odaico drum instead of the timpani. How about that?
You wouldn't have to pay me much to do that.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Catherine, if you can cut out my football comment, I'd appreciate it.
I think I'll lead with that, Mike. How about that? Just right off the top. The entire interview is just going to be your football comment. That's it.
Over and over. It's going to be a minimalist interview.
Looped.